I knew something was fundamentally wrong the second I saw a vintage gold Cadillac Escalade parked halfway across my hydrangeas, its heavy tires flattening the flowers I'd spent all spring nursing back to life. It was a humid Saturday morning, the kind where the air feels like a wet blanket, and I was just sitting there on my porch, minding my own business with a mug of black coffee, when I noticed the deep, muddy trenches carved into my lawn. It didn't in Oppos. T stopped with the Cadillac, though, because within minutes, 3 more SUVs rolled onto my grass like they were pulling into a VIP valet station at some fancy hotel, parking diagonally, carelessly, and with an arrogance that honestly made my blood start to simmer. My name is Silas Vance, and I bought this old stone farmhouse 3 years ago on the outskirts of Oak Creek Estates, mostly because I'm the kind of guy who likes his space and doesn't in Oppos. T want to hear his neighbor in Oppos. Television through the walls. It was a fixer-upper, sure, but the crown jewel of the purchase was the long, winding asphalt road that snakes up the ridge for about a third of a mile. It's the only way in or out for the 35 luxury homes tucked away in the hills above me. Now, technically, that road is part of my deed, a private path where the HOA has an easement agreement to pass through, but I've always been a live-and-let-live neighbor, signing off on their access out of a sense of community, even though I knew deep down that kindness in a place like this is often mistaken for weakness. End quote. Excuse me, you can in Oppos. T, just leave her truck there? End quote. A voice suddenly shrieked a high-pitched metallic sound that cut right through the morning bird song, and I looked over to see a woman in a crisp, white linen suit stepping out a Range Rover that was currently idling right in the middle of my prize-winning flower bed. This was Brenda Sterling, the HOA president and self-appointed empress of the Ridge, a woman who wore her highlights like a helmet and carried a diamond-encrusted iPad like it was a scepter of divine right. I just sat there, taking a slow sip of my coffee, watching her nostrils flare as she marched toward my porch, her stiletto heels sinking into the soft turf of my front yard with every aggressive step she took. End quote. Silas, you really need to move your vehicle and clear the walkway. We're hosting the Oak Creek Founders in Oppos Gala today, and we need every inch of this in Oppos. Common green and Oppos for the catering tents, and quote. She barked, not even looking me in the eye, but rather consulting her digital map as if I were just another piece of annoying garden furniture. I felt a slow, cold smile spread across my face as I stood up, leaning against the porch railing, and I told her as calmly as I could that she was standing on my private lawn, not a common green, and that her and Oppos, Founders in Oppos, Gala and Oppos, was currently trespassing on a man who hadn't into Oppos. T been invited to the party. She scoffed, a dry, dusty sound, and waved a hand toward the road, telling me that I lived in Oak Creek and therefore I was subject to the community and Oppos. Its needs, but I had to remind her, very slowly, that my house was built 40 years before the HOA even existed, and while I let them use my road to get to their fancy hilltop, I certainly never gave them permission to turn my vegetable garden into a parking lot. Brenda didn't in Oppos. Tea like that. Not one bit. And she stepped closer until I could smell her expensive perfume, telling me I was in Oppos. T being a in quote, team player in quote, and that she'd sent an email blast 3 weeks ago, which I must have ignored because I'm in quote, one of those difficult off-grid types, end quote. I watched as a crew of workers began unloading a massive, neon-colored bounce house from a flatbed truck, dragging the heavy vinyl right over my stone walkway, while another group started setting up a professional-grade DJ booth less than 10 feet from my garage. Someone even had the nerve to plug a high-voltage generator into my outdoor outlet without asking, and when a toddler in muddy sneakers ran up onto my porch and knocked my coffee mug right out of my hand, splashing hot liquid all over my boots, something inside me just snapped. I told Brenda to get everyone off my property in 10 minutes, or I was going to start calling tow trucks, and she just laughed a cruel, condescending titter, telling me that the end quote, community interest in quote, outweighed my quote, petty grievances and quote, and that I should be grateful they were beautifying the area for the day. She walked off toward the DJ, shouting orders about the playlist, completely ignoring the fact that she had just declared war on the man who owned the only bridge to her kingdom. I went inside, my heart thumping a steady, angry rhythm against my ribs, and I didn't in Oppos. T called the police. Not yet, because I knew that in a town like this, Brenda had the local sheriff on her speed dial for her Sunday brunches. Instead, I called my cousin Elias, who's an estate attorney with a memory like a steel trap and a personal vendetta against overreaching bureaucrats, and I told him exactly what was happening on my lawn. Elias didn't and oppose, to even skip a beat, telling me to pull up the original easement agreement from my safe, the one signed by the neighborhood's developer and the HOA board 5 years back, specifically the clause we'd inserted during the last road maintenance dispute. End quote. Silas, check section 4, paragraph C, end quote, Elias said, his voice crackling with a kind of professional glee that only lawyers get when they smell blood in the water, end quote. It says the easement is a privilege granted on the condition of and oppose, non-disruptive use and oppose, and specifically prohibits any temporary structures, commercial gatherings, or obstructions of the owner's primary residence. End quote. He told me that if there was physical damage to the land or a breach of the peace, the agreement allowed for an end quote, immediate emergency suspension of access, end quote, provided I gave notice, and I realized that by parking on my grass and setting up a carnival in my yard, Brenda hadn't and oppose. T just been annoying. She'd handed me the keys to the kingdom. I spent the next hour with my long lens camera, standing at the window and documenting everything. The oil leaking from the Cadillac onto my grass, the stakes being hammered into my irrigation lines for the tents, the DJ blasting bass-heavy house music that was literally rattling the glass in my window frames. I even caught footage of Brenda herself pointing at my side yard and telling the catering crew to dump their ice buckets right over my fence into my koi pond, which was the final straw. By 3 p.m, the party was in full swing, with dozens of people I'd never met wandering through my property, throwing paper plates at my bushes and letting their dogs relieve themselves on my porch steps, all while Brenda held court near the bounce house like she was the Queen of England. I walked down the steps, not with a shout this time, but with a thick manila folder and a heavy-duty chain I'd pulled from the shed, and I made a beeline for the vice president of the HOA, a guy named Marcus who I actually somewhat liked because he'd helped me jumpstart my mower once. End quote. Marcus, you need to look at this, end quote, I said, handing him the certified copy of the deed and the easement agreement, and his face went from a relaxed, party-ready tan to a ghostly, pale gray as he scanned the highlighted sections. I told him that the easement was officially suspended as of this moment due to gross violations of the and oppose, non-disruptive and oppose clause, and that the road, the only road, was being closed for, end quote, emergency maintenance, end quote, effective immediately. He tried to argue, stammering about how there were 75 cars up the hill and families who needed to get home for dinner, but I just pointed to the mud-caked trenches in my lawn and the generator hum coming from my own power bill. I told him he had 30 minutes to get the, end quote, commoners, end quote, off my land before I locked the gate at the bottom of the hill and called the county clerk to report the fraudulent property maps I'd just discovered in the HOA's public digital archive. You see, while I was waiting for Elias to call me back earlier, I'd done a little digging on the county assessor's website and found something that made my jaw drop. The HOA had filed a, end quote, corrected, end quote, plat map 2 years ago, one that conveniently showed my front 3 acres as, end quote, community green space, end quote, to lower their own tax liability on the common areas. It was a blatant amateurish attempt at land theft on paper, likely done by Brenda, to justify the HOA dues she was collecting for, end quote, landscaping, end quote, that they were never actually doing. When Brenda saw me talking to Marcus, she stormed over, her face a mask of fury, demanding to know why the music had stopped, because I'd pulled the plug on the generator, and I just held up the map, the real one with the county seal. I told her, end quote, Brenda, you've been telling these people they own my yard, so you could pocket the maintenance fees for a park that doesn't and oppose. T exist, and that's not just and oppose, disagreement and oppose. That's municipal fraud, end quote. The look on her face was something I'll cherish until the day I die. A mix of sheer, cold terror and the realization that she had finally pushed the wrong man into a corner he knew how to fight out of. She tried to bluster, claiming the map was just a, end quote, drafting error, end quote, and that I was being, end quote, hostile to the community, end quote, but I didn't oppose. T care anymore, so I walked down to the end of my drive, where the road meets the public highway, and I pulled the heavy iron gate shut, sliding the thick steel bolt into place and snapping a padlock that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. The silence that followed was deafening, as the realization began to ripple through the crowd of well-dressed neighbors that they were now effectively stranded on a hilltop with no way to get their luxury cars home unless I decided to let them pass. For the next 2 hours, it was chaos. People were screaming, Brenda was on her cell phone, probably screaming at her lawyer, and I just sat back on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the sunset over the ridge. On Monday morning, things went from bad to worse for the Oak Creek HOA, because I didn't end oppos. Just have a lawyer. I had the county zoning inspector, a guy named Miller who was a stickler for the rules, standing on my driveway with a clipboard and a very unhappy expression. We walked the perimeter, and Miller confirmed that the HOA had indeed misrepresented their boundaries to the state, which triggered an immediate audit of their entire financial history, an audit that revealed Brenda had been in, quote, diverting, in quote, nearly $80,000 of community funds into a private consulting firm owned by her brother-in-law. By noon, a white SUV from the State Financial Crimes Unit was parked at Brenda's house at the top of the hill, and by 3, she was being let out in handcuffs, not for the trespass on my lawn, but for the systematic embezzlement of her own neighbors and oppos' money. The rest of the board resigned in a frantic, panicked wave of emails, leaving poor Marcus to come down to my porch, hat in hand, literally trembling as he asked what it would take to get the gate open again so people could go to work. I didn't in oppos. Make it easy on them, because respect ISN and oppos. Something you can buy back with a quick apology. I made them sign a new, ironclad agreement that included a hefty monthly, in quote, road usage fee, in quote, that goes directly into a restoration fund for my property. I required them to install a permanent, high-definition camera system at the gate that I monitor, and I made it a legal requirement that the HOA send a certified letter to every resident admitting that the land they'd been told was, in quote, common ground, in quote, was in fact the private property of Silas Vance. The gate is open now, and the cars pass through quietly, never straying from the asphalt, and the neighbors, the ones who used to look through me like I was a ghost, now give me a polite, nervous wave every time they drive by. The grass has grown back, thicker and greener than before, and the oil stains are gone, but I kept the gold Cadillac's hood ornament that snapped off in my flower bed that day, sitting right there on my mantle as a little trophy. It's funny how people assume that because you're quiet, you're not paying attention, or that because you're kind, you're easy to walk over, but I think the folks at Oak Creek Estates finally learned a very valuable lesson about property lines and the man who owns the road. But now that the dust has settled and the, end quote, Empress, in quote, is awaiting trial, I have to wonder, did I go too far by trapping an entire neighborhood over a lawn, or was it the only way to make them finally see the person living at the bottom of the hill? What would you have done if you found a bounce house on your lawn and realized your neighbors had been, in quote, erasing, in quote, your property lines for years just to save a few bucks? Was I being a protector of my rights, or just a bitter man with a very big gate? Let me know in the comments, because I'm curious if you think justice was served, or if this is just the beginning of a whole new kind of neighborhood war. Call to action. This story shows just how far some people will go when they think they have a little bit of power, but it also shows that knowing your rights is the best defense you have. If you've ever had a run-in with an HOA that thought they owned your life, or a neighbor who didn't in oppos, understand the word, in quote, private, in quote, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment below, and let's talk about where the line should be drawn. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about people who finally stood their ground, and I'll see you in the next one.